cards. And it's interesting, people say today that the internet is abused by certain people. Well, lots of people produce these sort of saucy comic cards like this one here. It is no crime to kiss in Streatham. Here's another one here that you're in Streatham. Though you live in Streatham, don't crow about it. Happy thoughts from Streatham. When are you going to turn up in Streatham? Turn up, you see. And then, I'm sorry, I've got a little behind in Streatham. And so all these cards, it just exploded. These comic cards became very fashionable, particularly in the time of the Second World War. And the cards we're seeing here, love will find a way. And here, may you have a well-filled Christmas stocking. And a famous one there, I can't see my little Willie. All of these are by a well-known comic artist who lived in Streatham called Donald McGill. But of course, some people abuse the cards with saucy cards like this. And these are obviously cards that were sent to men. And here's some cards sent to women. Oh, I don't know how he got in there. But you can see just how popular these cards were. And here is a Sinclair's Booksellers at 89 Streatham High Road. And if you look very closely in the window, you can see the window, particularly the two on the left, are absolutely full of postcards, so that people passing by the shop would look and then go in and buy them. And what I'm going to do now is just introduce you to some of the cards made by a handful of local businesses in Streatham who photographed local scenes and sold them as postcards in their shop. And I'm starting with a chap called Edgar Beach. He had his shop at 100 Mitcham Lane. And again, we can see his shop here. And if you look very, very closely, you can see his postcards in the window. Normally with these people, the giveaway is they produce a card with their shop in it. And this is the card that Edgar Beach produced of Mitcham Lane. And it was quite common to put what the card was in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see it here, Mitcham Lane, Streatham. And normally there would be on the front of the card or on the back the name of the producer. And the reason for that was because these cards were being sent all over the world. And therefore it was quite convenient to have, here's a view of Mitcham Lane, and it saved people having to write it when they sent the cards to family or friends. Here's a photographic card that Edgar made of St Nicholas's Church in Tooting. And if you turn it over, you would see that he's stamped with a rubber stamp his name and address at the bottom. And he did this so that people who received a card would write to him and say, oh, I'd like 12 of those that I can use myself. It was all to encourage business. But some of his cards, now I don't know whether anybody recognised where that view is. Anybody know? Yes. It's the end of Babington Road. We've got Streatham Green on the right, and we've got where the mosque is now, used to be the fire station on the left, and we're looking up Mitcham Lane towards St Leonard's Church. But I put this view in because you can see that he's identified the card as Mitcham Lane, and then in brackets he's put Beach again so that people know who he was. And he sold quite a large number of cards during his time, and he would send people promotional cards. Now, this is a card here of Aldrington Road on the Streatham Park Estate, and on the back of it, he's written in his own handwriting, plain or coloured, a penny each, or 7 for 6pence, real photographs, as opposed to a screen printed card. They were slightly more expensive, well, they're twice as much expensive, weren't they? 2pence each, or 7 for a shilling. And so he would send these cards out to people and they would place orders. And as I say, the joy of these cards was the speed at which people would receive them and how they could be used like we would use text messages today. So let's have a look at some of the cards that he produced. Most of them centred on the Streatham Park Estate and Mitcham Lane, because that's where his shop was, and that's where most people would want to buy them. And here's a view of Mitcham Lane, looking from outside his shop up towards the railway bridge. And then another view of Mitcham Lane, looking towards his shop now, with the Park Tavern Hotel on the left, which is now called the Fursdown, used to be called the Samuel Johnson. It's had a number of names, but that's the old building before it was rebuilt in the 1930s. And the joy of these photographic cards, because there were two types, A real photographic card was a photograph where you wrote on the back of the photograph is the detail that they contained. And here you can see from that card a bus going to Streatham Common, and you can see it parked outside the pub. And look, here you can see a lady and two girls here carrying their shopping, and a bike and a milk float. The detail in some of the photographic cards is quite astounding. And the reason for that was because these pictures would be taken on glass plates. So some of you may have seen old photographs of photographers standing with a camera on a tripod with a blanket over his head. That's how these pictures were taken. And they had glass plates that they used as negatives. And the detail on those glass plates was really quite outstanding. And here is another card of Babington Road. The early cards that were coloured were quite crudely coloured because they didn't have the technology to do a better job. But here we have a card where they've just put a sandy wash, a red wash and a green wash over a postcard to provide a little bit more colour, to make it a little bit more attractive for people to buy. And that's Babington Road. And here's a typical real picture postcard of Pretoria Road, again, a road off of Mitcham Lane. And here is a screen printing card of West Drive. And this is where we get so many of our old views from, of Streatham, from these old postcard views. And here we see Westcott Road. The houses here would have been quite recently built. Some of them would have only been 20 or 30 years old. Here's a view of Streatham Common. As you can see, a very busy high road. You'll kill yourself crossing that road, wouldn't you? But the interesting thing here is just look at the trees, the conker trees there. You know, they were only about 5 or 7 years old at the time that photograph was taken. Now, of course, they're quite massive. If you look at the road, you can see it's a dirt road. You can see horses have left messages on the road and so on. Hadn't even been tarmacked. Streatham at this time was being transposed from a country village into a southern suburb of London. And here is St John's Church in Erdley Road. A lovely postcard this, because the ground before it hadn't yet been built with houses. A young lad standing in front of the church. And there's a picture of St Leonard's Church where we had the railings up outside around the churchyard before they were taken in the Second World War. And these cards would have been sold in their thousands. And I have been collecting these cards for many years now, and the same views come up again and again and again because so many people collected them. Well, another publisher, no relation to me, was Walter Brown, and he had his shop in that row of premises not far from where Aldi's is today, next to what used to be the Bedford Park Hotel. And there's another view of his shop. He basically ran a printing business, but because the profit to be made from producing postcards was so high, he quickly realized that he could make a lot of money by printing postcards. And so that's what he did. And here's one of his packets where he would sell return thanks cards with baby name cards and business cards and so on, and the other stationery products that he produced at his printing works. His business grew quite quickly, and he moved from living above his shop in Streatham High Road to his rather handsome house in 107 Babington Road in 1894. And he was one of our very early photographic and printed postcard producers. He advertised extensively, mainly in church magazines and in the Streatham local press, and his business flourished. And here is a picture of the Church of the English Martyrs. The pictures are very simple. They're all screen printed, i.e. they've been screened with dots, and they're printed on quite cheap card. And they again have a space on them, either at the side or the bottom for the message. And this is a view taken from the top of Streatham Common. And if you look on the left-hand side of the card, down by the foot of the tree, you can see where he's written his name and his address so that people knew where the cards were coming from. And here's another one at the pond at the top of Streatham Common. Again, a simple printed card. And there's another one of the same pond, but a few more people in it. The photographers at the time found out that people in a picture brought it to life and made it much more saleable. Doesn't matter what they're doing, it doesn't matter whether they're pretty or ugly or what they're wearing, but they tended to add a bit of interest to the card. And here's another card, an early card of the Lower Pond. And then there's a view there from Valley Road, from the top of Valley Road, looking down towards the then village of Streatham. As you can see, it's surrounded by fields, and you can see in the middle the spires of St Leonard's Church and the Church of the English Martyrs. And then right over on the left, the spire of the Old Methodist Church. This was the Streatham my father knew, a Streatham of fields, a rural Streatham, a country Streatham, which was as it was before the First World War. And there's a picture of the library. And if you look towards the left-hand side of the library, look, there's an open field there. Nothing has been built. And on the right-hand side, again, there are trees. Nothing has been built. This picture was probably taken in 1898 when the library first opened. You will notice it hasn't got the clock on it, which was added in 1911, 1912. And then the popular view looking down the high road. Why did he take that view? He took the view because his shop was on the left-hand side with the name printers on. And it's rather interesting that many people who produce cards, they always had their shop in the view. And there's another one looking down the dip. Again, a bit more action here, a few people in it, and a horse-drawn cart coming up the hill. And then one looking down the high road. Again, probably I would date this about 1899, early 1900s. And these were the very early cards that people were sending to their friends and relatives all over the country. As Streatham was exploding with new residents coming into the area, these were the cards that they would send to their friends or back home to the family to say, this is where I'm living. Lovely view here of the church, the Congregational Church, built in 1901, so we can date this as being turn of the century. And then he started producing coloured cards, and these are dated from around 1905, and all these are the basic cards we've just been looking at, but now he's printing the whole card and he's giving them a very simple colour wash to make them a little bit more attractive for people to buy. And again, the first card shows his shop, and then the others. I rather like these cards by Walter Brown because I think they're nice, calm colours, aren't they? They're all subdued colours. And this is a lovely view of St Leonard's Church and the graveyard. St Peter's Church. Churches were very popular because lots of people would visit churches. They'd go brass rubbing or do bell ringing or in the choir and so on. And so they could send their friends a picture of the church which they attended. And here's one of Streatham Hill. Very busy Streatham Hill, busy Saturday morning there. And there's a train going into Streatham Hill Station. And there's the tram depot looking down Telford Avenue. Again, you can see the subtlety of the colours. And then, of course, the ubiquitous view up the high road. And then one looking down to the Church of the English Martyrs. And you'll notice the dice fountain that used to stand on the junction there before it was removed to the green. And then we've got one at the top of Streatham Common, the Grove, the pathway leading to Norwood Grove. And then later on, and I'm now moving from about 1905 up to about 1908, 1910, he started producing these real photographic cards. And as I say, the detail in the cards can really be quite astounding. Here we see Pratt's on the left, the famous department store, on the library on the right. And there's another one of the Congregational Church. And of course, there was a nursery next to the Congregational Church, not for children, but for plants, before it was developed with buildings. And then we have Streatham Place with the old pub there, which was rebuilt in the 1930s. Closer view there of the pub. And you can see a greyhound there resting on a plinth just above the entrance door. And again, looking across to the eating house there, the dining rooms, John Holt's dining rooms, and the building that's there today is the Winning Post Cafe. So, for well over 100 years, people have been taking refreshment from that spot. And there's a view looking again from the first pond across to Emmanuel Church. Another views of the common with the park keeper standing outside the hut at the top of the common in his uniform. There's a closer view of him. And then another view looking down the avenue. And these cards of the commons would have been sold to people who were just visiting the common on a day on holiday or for a day out, so that they could send to friends. And then another view, Streatham Common North here, with at the junction of Liam Court Road with what used to be Park Hill, the gates to Park Hill on the left. And so we come to another publisher, H. Bush and Sons, at 48 Sunny Hill Road. H. Bush started the business, but he died within a couple of years, and his wife took the business on with her sons, but she never changed the name. They traded as H. Bush, but he was dead, but she continued to trade. And she specialised in cards for Sunny Hill Road and Wellfield Road, and Liam Lane was a name that was used for Sunny Hill Road before the street was renamed. And she mainly produced cards of those areas. Here's one that she's done of Sunny Hill Road, looking up the hill towards the White Lion. They've got a nice horse and cart on the right for interest, but even more importantly, on the left, you can see her shop. Again, always there if you know where to look. And what detail? Here we see a man driving a little donkey cart. You know, if we go back to the picture, there he is. Can you see him in front of the chap with the bike? And you can see the detail in the picture can be quite surprising when you blow them up. And there's another view looking up the road to towards the White Lion. Some postcard publishers were very helpful in that they put a number. She's put Sunny Hill Road number 6. So if you're collecting the cards, you know there must be at least 6 in that collection. And if you've got 4, you know there's 2 more to find. And here is another view. This is number 4, look, looking up the hill towards the Valley Road end of Sunny Hill Road. And again, you can see the children there, and you can see this wonderful cart in the distance. Anybody know what that cart is? It's a coal cart. The man is delivering coal, and he needs the ladders so he can take the sacks of coal from the top to deliver it to local people. And here's another view, Sunny Hill Road. I was wrong that there's 8 cards in this set. Looking to the open fields by Valley Road. And because it took a long time for the photographer to set up the view, remember I said he had to set up his tripod, he had to throw the blanket over his head, and he had to put in the glass plate. It gave time for lots of children to gather round to see, well, what's this bloke doing? And so you see lots of children in many pictures, particularly for the poorer streets where they would have been living in greater numbers. And here we are, Wellfield Road, looking down Wellfield Road, again towards Valleyfield Road. And you can see the creepers growing on the houses on the left. Very popular in Edwardian times to get ivy and creepers over the front of your house. It made it look very rural and countrified. And then this is a nice shot of the Liam Arms pub, again taken by Mr. Bush. And on the right-hand side, the shops you can see. And there you can see the horse having breakfast or dinner, eating from an old oat bag, brightly painted, the wagon that he's pulling. And here you can see the butcher. Look, his windows are open, the meat are on display, just ready for the flies to call. And next door is the fishmonger. His window is open. You can see him standing here. What a lovely aroma at that corner it must have been on a hot June evening. And there we can see, look, milk is being delivered. And this trap at the back is going so fast, it appears just as a haunting ghost-like shadow in the picture, captured in a moment in time. And so we come to Western Terrace. This was a group of very old cottages that existed opposite the bottom of Streatham Common. And these cottages dated back to the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And they were built from ship's timbers with mud walls. That's like a lithe plasterboard with mud put on them, just a very simple construction. And they were originally built for farm labourers. But by the time you get to the 1900s, when these cottages were about 100 or more years old, the ground floors had been converted into shops, and many of the upper floors were no longer used as bedrooms, but were stock rooms for the produce that was being sold in the shop. And Bertha Chittenden was a late producer of postcards. She took over the old South Streatham post office in 1922, and she decided to produce a series of 6 cards that she could sell, again, mainly to people who are visiting the common. And here you can see one of her cards looking across the common towards Emmanuel Church, but on the left there is her shop. And these were very popular cards. You can pick these up quite easily and quite cheaply, mainly I think because many people going to the common would have gone to the post office, bought the cards and then posted them from there. And there's another view of Emmanuel Church. Her shop is just out of this picture. And then a view looking up the high road to where Hambley House mansions are, Potter and Perrin, you know, the kitchen and bathroom people today, and then buildings further north that were destroyed in the war. And you can see the old water trough at the bottom of the common, where it used to stand until the road was widened in the 1970s. And then we have several views of the Rookery Gardens. And these cards would have been sold in the cafe at the Rookery for the purposes I've already described. And at this time, the Rookery Gardens were about 20 years old. So the gardens show some maturity with the planting, and the trees and shrubs are nearly fully grown. And then a picture there of the garden. You can see the well to the left, you can see the sundial, but you notice the pond still has got to have its fountain, hadn't been installed at that time. But lots of creepers over the swags of creepers over the trellis around the pond, very popular in Edwardian times, although this is a bit later, it's just 1922. Now, some of the publishers of postcards in Streatham, we just don't know who they are. And one company that we don't know who they are is CP Company. And there is their logo at the bottom of the card. And yet we know they produced at least 151 cards, because he tells you this is card 151. And there it is, a view at the top of Streatham Common. And these are rather nice because he took nice pictures. He was prepared to wait until the image was, you know, looking a bit more interesting. But I don't know who he or she or they were. All I know is that they traded as CP & Co. And I know that they're local, because all the cards I've seen with that legend have either been Streatham or parts of North Brixton. Another view there of Streatham Common. And then we're getting further north here, Holmwood Gardens up at the top end of Streatham Hill. And here is a view. Does anybody recognise where that is? It's got Streatham High Road. Well, believe it or not, that's Streatham High Road. That is looking down Streatham High Road with the Congregational Church on the left. And you can just see, if I show you, you can just see the tower of the Congregational Church here, hidden by the trees. And again, you can see the nursery here, a telltale building. And then this building here was the cab shelter. This is where the horse cab drivers went for a hot cup of tea in the winter months and refreshments throughout the year. And you can see the cabs lining up there, waiting to get customers from Streatham railway station. And I think the point I would make here, my own father would not recognise that as being Streatham High Road, but that's what it was like 100 years ago. And you can zoom in and you can get a view. I mean, you would think you're in the heart of the countryside. There's so many trees, so many bushes, only the people about. That suggests to you this was taken on a Sunday morning, because they're all in their Sunday best clothes. And there's another view showing the cabs and the buildings behind. So we're looking at a rural Streatham here before it became suburbanised. And there's another view looking up the high road. The building on the right there is the old police station. That's where the police station is today. And another one looking up past the library, again with Pratt's on the left-hand side. And look at the ladies standing there in their finery on the left. I would date this picture as probably being probably in the 1890s, early 1900s, because of the way the sleeves of those lady clothes are puffed up. That became very popular. It started in the mid-1890s as a small puff, And then by the time you get to 1899, it was silly. You know, the puffs were huge. And then by the time you get to about 1992, it faded from fashion and something else took over. Oh, well, there we are. There's the pictures, and you can see the puffs in the sleeves. And there's a view. Again, we're looking towards Emmanuel Church. We've got the Pied Bull on the left. We've got some ancient cottages on the left also. And then it's interesting that you can see the tall trees on the right-hand side hiding a very old and interesting building behind. And that was the problem with Streatham. Many front gardens were screened by large trees. So when photographers went down the High Road taking pictures, some of the most interesting houses didn't have their picture taken because you couldn't see them from the street. They had been screened off by vegetation in that way. But again, here's some boys larking around on a delivery van that you can see the detail from the glass plate of the photograph. And here is another view taken by the same company looking up the High Road. And on the right-hand side, it was still residential. By the time you get to the early 1900s, Streatham High Road was mainly a residential road with houses on either side, but it was the left-hand side of the road, the western side of the road, that was developed first, and it was the right-hand side that was developed second. And where those large trees are standing, that's where the Odeon Cinema is today. And then again, we're looking at Streatham Hill. Many people who see these cards think, oh, isn't it wonderful that somebody has taken these pictures of old buildings in Streatham? Well, they didn't. They took pictures of new buildings in Streatham. When they were taking these cards, they were taking pictures that some of them were only 5 years old. And you sent it to people to say, look, I'm living in a modern place here. But today we tend to think, oh, look, old Streatham. But it's not. We're looking at the new Streatham of the Edwardian era. And then a nice view there of Christchurch. And again, you can zoom in and you can see a chap there, a delivery boy on his tricycle going down Christchurch Road, probably delivering fish or groceries to local residents. So let's go back to Streatham High Road to CP Harold Lawrence, who had his shop at 189 Streatham High Road. He didn't produce many cards, but he was a pioneer of colour printed cards. And on the back of his cards, there is his legend. And he gave his cards these weird numbers, D452/1047. This makes you think that he's produced either 452 cards or 1,047 cards. He hadn't. To the best of my knowledge, he produced 6 cards, but it was to give his business some form of status. You'll think, well, here is a man that knows what he's doing. And there is his view, looking up the High Road with the green on the left, and you can see his shop on the right-hand side. So he meets the first criteria of being a postcard publisher, have your shop in the view. And there it is. Nicely coloured, but really quite crudely done. If you want good quality coloured postcards, you have to send them to Germany to be done. They did the very best coloured postcards. In England, we hadn't got quite the balance right. But here's another of his views. Again, a nice coloured card, but the colouring is a bit crude. You know, he hasn't quite captured the colour of the library. But this would have been an astounding card to send to your friends in the early 1900s. Some of us, old as Tim and I, can remember the introduction of colour television. And because it was colour television, you'd watch whatever trash was on there because it's colour. And likewise with the cards, you would be forgiven if the card was badly coloured. It was coloured, and therefore it was worthy of sending to your friends. Now there's a view. Anybody recognise it? Well, you don't have to. I've told you, it's Tooting Bec Road, isn't it, at the top? But there are children standing in the middle of Tooting Bec Road in the early 1900s. And you wouldn't send children in the middle of the road today. But this road leading down to the hamlet of Tooting Bec in the parish of Streatham, hardly any traffic on the road at all. And then a view there of the churchyard and the Church of the English Martyrs on the left. And you can see that on the right-hand side, some flowers. So there must have been a flower seller who had a store there at that time. And then another view of St. Peter's Church that we saw earlier. The colours are all wrong, but it's a nice card, pleasing to the eye. There's a couple of children standing by the gate, and I would have thought that that was a card that would sell very well. If you look on the left-hand side of that picture, can you see a line going down through the trees down to the fence? What happened there is he obviously took a square picture and he realised that the card was 6 inches by 4 inches. So he's had to copy something on the left-hand side. He's had to bodge it up a bit to make it look full picture. And there's his picture there of Streatham Common. This was a popular view. You've got the church on the right, you've got the keeper's hut, you've got the pond, and you've got this rather strange but rather attractive collection of trees. And here is one of his black and white cards at the top of the common by the keeper's hut. And again, you can zoom in and you can see a family there having a picnic on the common there. Mum and dad, a dog, and their baby daughter. And that is a screen print card because you can see it's mottled, it's not a real picture card. So the detail there is quite good. And so we come to Frederick W. Over, another of Streatham's leading postcard publishers. He had his business at 190 Streatham High Road, and you can see his shop on the left here in this postcard view. He started living above his shop, but in 1984, he and his sisters moved to Montreal Road in Streatham Hill. And they continue to produce cards, and some very good cards over the years. He ran his stationer's business from his shop in the High Road, and his sisters helped him, in serving in the shop. He started off by having a shop at 1 Eldon Place, which was the first shop you see on the left there, next door to the White Lion Public House. But as his business expanded, he moved to larger premises down the road, which we saw earlier in that picture on the left. And as well as doing stationery and postcards, he also ran a library. A number of people ran a library before the public libraries were up and running, and you would pay, twopence or threepence a week, and you could borrow books from the library in the shop. Boots, the chemists, were very famous between the wars for the libraries that they operated from their shops. So let's have a look at some of his cards, and they're beautiful sepia-coloured photographic cards. This view you might not immediately recognise. On the right-hand side, we see the Empire Cinema. That's now where the Hideaway is. And you can see that what used to be the Bedford Park Hotel or pub next door to it, and then a church steeple of one of Streatham's lost churches, the old Methodist church that stood where the sports shop now stands, selling Nike shoes and football shirts and so on. And here we see his card of St Leonard's Church. Virtually all of the major postcard sellers, they all tended to take pictures of the same things in Streatham, the common, the church, and so on. So you see the views over and over. But Mr. Over, Frederick Over, had a deal with a major London publishing house called Valentine's, where Valentine's would produce the cards and they'd put them out in his name. And that's why on this card on the left, you can see his name, and on the right, you can see Valentine. But because he sold so many cards, that was an arrangement of mutual advantage. And there we can see it again. Looking up the High Road again, we've seen this view lots of times. Again, a horse track coming down the road and lots of people in their Edwardian finery. A picture of the library, an early picture of the library, no clock, no tram line, so it's before 1908. And there's a picture after 1912. We've got the tram and we've got the clock, so that helps us date it. And there we got Pratt's department store. And Pratt's features in a number of these postcards you see. Almost certainly they would have stocked these in the shop, to sell. And therefore you would include them in the view to get sales. Now here's a strange view that some of you may not recognise, but I told you earlier how most of Streatham High Road in the early 1900s was residential, with houses with large gardens in the front. Well, here we see a view just taken past the Horse and Groom public house, looking up towards Streatham Hill Station. And if you look very closely, you can see somebody's put a cross where the station is, over the station. And almost certainly when you turn that card over, it would say, you know, I've marked the station for you so you know where the station is when you get out and come to see me. So a residential road, large gardens, carriage driveways, still to be developed with the shops that we know today. And Streatham Hill likewise. Residential on the right, shops on the left. And then at the top of Streatham Hill, we have the Crown and Sceptre, and we have that lovely parade of early Edwardian shops that were bombed in the war that don't exist anymore, and Brixton Hill in the distance. Frederick also produced some cards for local businesses, and this is a card he obviously produced for Streatham Hill High School, now Streatham Hill and Clapham High School for girls. And again, this card would have been used by pupils attending the school, you know, to write home to mum and to be in contact with friends. And here's a coloured card, the view looking down Streatham Hill North. You've got Liam Court Road on the right, nicely coloured, lots of different shades of green there through the printing process, probably printed in Germany, I would suspect. And then there's hundreds of cards of the Common. And some of the cards on the Common, you wonder why he took it, because it's the bottom left-hand corner one, you know, there's just a tree, you know, but there you are. And then he's got some pictures here of the Rookery Garden, very popular postcard site. And then he would produce multi-view cards. A number of publishers did this. They would take one card and they'd put 4 or 5 or 6 different views on it. So for your same penny, you've got 6 views, not just one view. And that was very popular. So George Frederick Payne, he had his shop near Streatham Green on that part of the high road that was then known as the Broadway. The shops between Ambleside Avenue and Streatham Green used to be known as the Broadway, but they subsequently now have been split between Glenagle Road and the High Road. And there's a picture there of the Broadway, one of his cards, and you can see his shop in the middle there within that picture. A wonderful parade of shops, I think. We don't really see it to do justice to it, by 2 well-known local architects, Frederick Wheeler and Henry Holland, who did a number of buildings in Streatham. In fact, Frederick Wheeler, a lot of the old buildings in Streatham we can attribute to him. And there is his venture into colour photography, not very good, very crude. And because he's used a printing process for this, that they've had to put a colour wash on it in a very crude way, and so you've lost the effect of the photograph. But still, as I say, it's in colour and worth a penny, isn't it, really? And there's another view showing Emmanuel Church. Again, he hasn't quite got the colour mix right here, but still, in 1905, that would have been a very attractive card to buy. And here we see him looking down at Glen Eldon Road. The Broadway is on the right, and then that lovely triangular building on the left. Again, guess who were the architect of that building? Of course, Frederick Wheeler and Holland. Still there today. And then, of course, we get views of the ponds and the high road again. And put this one in for Tony, because you can see Borup's shop on the right there. Tony Borup was a local photographer who specialised in portraiture rather than topographical views. But again, this tells you, look, there's massive great shops on the right-hand side and houses on the left. Congregational Church, I would date that card probably 1905. The church is beginning to be hidden by the trees in front of it. And so we come to Alfred Rayner. Alfred Rayner is an interesting man. He was a chemist, and he had his shop, as we see there, where the El Bleo or Bleb shop is today. Alfred Rayner was a chemist, and he comes to Streatham and he opens his chemist business in this shop. And he thinks to himself, how can I promote my chemist business? And he says, I know what I do. I will produce a series of postcards of drawings of old Streatham, which you can only get by me. So when you come into my shop to buy the postcards, you'll be able to buy your potions and your aspirins and your medication at the same time. It was a good idea, but it didn't quite work. The good idea was selling the postcards. The bad idea was he didn't sell much medicine. And within a year, Godden's Cash Chemist had taken over the business. But he did sell a lot of postcards. And that was for a number of reasons. The first reasons is they depicted an old Streatham. And we can see here the wrapper. If you bought a complete set of these cards, obviously it cost you £1, whereas if you bought them individually, it cost you slightly more. And this was the wrapper that were on the cards. And these cards were drawn by a local artist called Holland Tringham. And some of you are saying, I know a pub of that name. And there's a pub in Streatham named after him. And Holland Tringham, in his day, was a very noted and accomplished artist. And what was the death of his business was the introduction of screen printing photography, because his illustrations, his line-drawn illustrations, appeared in the Illustrated London News, the Graphic, all the major magazines of the day. But as soon as screen printing came in, nobody wanted to see line drawings anymore. They wanted to see photographic reproductions with screen printings. Now, some of those photographs are awful. You know, I have seen the early production, but they were photographs. And so that's what made them successful. And so poor Holland Tringham, his business declined. As I say, a pub in Streatham is named after him. Ironical, because as his business declined, his family life declined, and he turned to drink. And he died a drunkard on the Isle of Man. And I think it is rather strange that Wetherspoons has chosen the name of their pub for a man who killed himself with drink. Anyway, let's have a look at some of his views. There's only 6 of them, and we'll spend a little bit of time on them. As you can see on the right-hand side, the most important thing, Rayner, late Robinson Streatham. Well, Robinson ran the chemist business, which Mr. Rayner bought. And these cards were to promote that swap over of business. It's called Old Streatham, and here is a picture, he says, of St Leonard's Church in 1600. And there's a picture of the etching in the London Metropolitan Archives on which Holland Tringham based that drawing. Obviously, Holland wasn't alive in 1600, so he had to have some idea what the church looked like. Holland Tringham was a master of drawing trees. And I can recognize a Holland Tringham drawing just by looking at the trees, because he was so exceptional. And you can see here, you can get a glimpse. Look at the gorse at the bottom there of that image. You know, you can almost get stung if you put your hand in there. He had that expertise with his artistic craft. And there's his view of Streatham Green, the elm trees on the front, looking across to the old cottages that used to be opposite the green. He's dated this 1807. It's not 1807. The date 1807 has been used on these cards so that Mr. Rayner can say it's showing Streatham 100 years ago, because he published them in 1907. We've yet to find the picture on which that view was taken. There is one, because all his pictures were taken, all Holland's drawings were taken with pictures for these cards, but we haven't found that one yet. There we have the Greyhound public house in 1807. And we can see a long, thin building built up over a number of years, and a man with a horse trap in the front. And there is the picture on which he based the drawing. Down to the fact that the man with his horse cart is still in the same position, and the driver is in the picture. You can see him on the right, although his coach isn't in the picture here, just the man standing there, because Holland wanted to show the whole of the building. And there we have Streatham Forge, that stood at the junction of Streatham High Road and Mitcham Lane. And there is the picture upon which Holland Tringham did the drawing. And again, he's chosen to do these drawings in the winter because he doesn't want the scene spoilt by trees loaded with leaves, and then of course you wouldn't be able to see the buildings. And there we have the Horse and Groom pub, the early Horse and Groom pub as it was up till 1865. And there is the drawing on which he based it. He hasn't put all the people in, but he has put one of the men standing there. And this is why we know that he's copied his illustration from the pictures, because the man is standing there. And then we have these cottages behind the forge. Again, he says 1807, but it's a later view. And there's the picture on which he has based his drawing. And all he's done is he's drawn the buildings as appeared in the picture, and he's just put a lady in there to provide sort of a focal point of interest. So we move on to another Streatham publisher, SP and P&Co. And this is another of our mystery publishers. We don't know who he, she, or they were, but they produced a number of very lovely cards. They're beautifully printed, they're in colour, the colours are bold and they're clear, and the postcards are on extra thick card. And therefore, because he's using top quality photographic card, he's getting a top quality product as a postcard. Let's have a look at some of his work. And this is one dating from probably the 1920s, I would suggest, of the high road. And here's one looking down Tooting Bec Road. There's a bus coming, dating that card, as I say, to the 1920s. But you can see the quality there. The greens are more vibrant and more natural. The skies are always the same colour of blue. In all his pictures, the sky is always the same colour of blue. So the colours are slightly artificial in that regard, but the quality of the card is there to be admired. And again, I would suspect that some of these may have been published in Germany after the First World War, because they still were able to produce coloured cards. Many of his cards are subtly coloured. And there's two there on Tooting Bec Common of boys fishing in one of the lakes. And there's one of Thrale Road, down towards Tooting Bec Common. And there's the top end of Thrale Road, just looking before you get the bend. If anybody's interested, the top card on the left, you can see Sadiq Khan's house. That's where the Mayor of London lives. There's another view of Mitcham Lane, looking down the lane towards where the First Down pub is now. Again, can you notice the blue of the sky, same sort of colour, lovely tonal reds for the housing. And there's another view. Unbeknown to them, they've actually got Mr. Beech's house, a rival in that view. But a nice card. And there's a card of the Streatham Baptist Church in Mitcham Lane and St James's Church. Again, lovely contrast of colour. And there's the Riggindale Road Methodist Church, still in existence today, all of those churches. And because we've got images here of Tooting Bec Common, we've got images of Mitcham Lane, we've got images of Thrale Road, I suspect that he operated in that area, because most postcard publishers were not just publishing the cards, they were selling them. And you're not going to sell many cards of Mitcham Lane in Streatham Hill, are you? You're going to have to be in Mitcham Lane or Thrale Road to get the business. And there's a nice card he did of St Albans Church. Doesn't exist anymore, lost after the war. But again, beautiful colour reproduction there. He's cut the building into the edge of the card, which is rather nice. That was not easy to do in those days. And again, the blue sky, the ubiquitous blue sky, crowns that picture. And here's a picture of the rookery in Streatham Garden, up at Streatham Common. This is an early picture of what used to be called the White Garden. But obviously this card, I think, has been coloured in Germany because the plants here are red and yellow and blue. They didn't realise they should all be white. And if you're producing a colour card, the last thing you want is one with all white flowers in it, because you want to show the colour, don't you? And so we come to the Streatham News Agency. They were at 81 Streatham High Road. Again, a very early producer of postcards, and I'm not quite sure whether they were actually a news agency or they may have just been supplying images to newspapers for screening and reproduction. And they produced not many cards, but nice cards, and you could buy them either black and white or you could buy them in colour. Sometimes the colour was quite bold, sometimes, as in this card, it was subtly tinted. And I think the subtly tinted cards are rather pleasing to the eye. And then probably one of my most favourite cards of Streatham. It's showing Streatham in its Edwardian splendour there, the ladies in their finery, the young children, the horse-drawn bus, the policeman. When did the last time you saw a policeman in Streatham? There they are, the big lamppost, epitomises the affluence and the desirability of Streatham at that time as a residential location. And there's their card looking down the high road towards Mitcham Lane. And there's their multi-view card, showing some of the other cards they did. As I mentioned earlier, multi-view cards were quite popular because you could get 6 views for the price of 1, or even 7 views, as on this card. And this card, I suspect, was before 1904, because there's you've got your little square at the bottom right-hand corner for your message. So I presume that this was produced before they had the divided back. Then we have a series of cards which are called the Streatham series. And some of these cards have been produced by the Streatham News Agency. So I think when the Streatham News Agency went out of business, they sold the images of their cards to a firm that produced them as the Streatham series. And they're all really quite nice cards. Again, you see the Southern Pond looking towards Greyhound Lane. The ubiquitous view there up the high road. The library, again without a clock, so it's before 1912. And the trams have been extended, so that makes it between 1908 and 1912. Young man on the left with a rather cheeky bowler hat. And can you see the lady next to him with her brolly up, and yet it's not raining? And that is because it's not a brolly, it's a parasol. Ladies in those days would have parasols to protect them from the harsh sunlight. There's a nice view of St Leonard's Church. And then we have a number of views, again, of the common and its ponds. And then we're coming to the end of our major producers now. Mr. Trinnaman, he had his shop at 104 Streatham High Road. Ah, you say his shop clearly says 86. The shop was renumbered. And that's why we've got 2 different numbers. But again, you can see his window, the little squares, are all postcards that he is selling to the local population. And his shop was between the Green and Streatham junction with Mitcham Lane. And here's one of his cards of the library. And you can see the bottom right-hand corner. He must remind people where you get those cards. So he puts his name and address. And then another card showing part of Streatham Common. You've got Bank Parade on the right and Emmanuel Church in the middle of the card, rather nicely coloured. And then you've got this view looking down the dip with the old cottages on the left-hand side. And the colours here are quite subtle, but if you count them, he's not using more than 4 or 5 colours to print these cards. The more colours you use, the more expensive it is, because every time you put a colour on the card, you have to put it through the machinery another time. And then looking down from Streatham High Road down towards the junction of Mitcham Lane. And you can see here very clearly where those shops on the left have been built on the front gardens of the houses behind. As the area became more suburbanised and there grew more need for shops, people surrendered up their front gardens to have shops built for trade. And there's his view of the Methodist church that stood on the corner of Sternhold Avenue and the High Road. A massive Methodist church there. It was where Lord Soper was married, the famous Methodist preacher who used to preach on Tower Hill and at Speaker's Corner. His father was treasurer at that church. And again, on the back of the card and to the side of the card, Mr. Trinnaman puts his name and address to secure trade. Now we come to Richard Cloud Hill and Eleanor Hill. These were photographers, and they came to Streatham to set up a photography business in the 1890s. And they specialised in portraiture. And in these 2 pictures that they took, we can see on the right-hand side, the Reverend John Nicol, who was rector of Streatham for over 60 years. And on the left-hand side, we can see his wife. And if you're in the photography business in Streatham and you can take a picture of the rector, then everybody's going to come to your shop and have their picture taken. And there's just, some of the pictures that they took. His business was taken over by S.E. Pollard. And here is a picture of Mrs. Pollard, obviously taken by her husband, using his photographic studio for the task. And again, at that time, these studios were mainly just taking pictures of people. When a photographer was taking a picture of a person then, he was using a rather, because it was inside a studio and the lighting was not 100%, he was using a slow exposure, so you had to stay perfectly still. And many of these pictures, behind the man would be a metal brace in which he rested his head, so he couldn't move his head about, otherwise the picture would be blurred. And Mr. Pollard sold his business to Wickham Studios. And Wickham was a very large business. They continued with the photographic portraiture work, which was profitable. They expanded their shops to Balham. And here we can see their shop in Balham because we've got the sign outside saying Wickham's Studio. But they also produced a number of the very early photographic views of Streatham. And when I say early, again, we're looking at these views being taken in the very late 1890s, early 1900s. And again, on the left-hand side at the bottom, must tell you who this was by, photo by Wickham. And there is a view looking up the high road with the White Lion Public House on the left-hand side. And I would suspect that when this picture was taken, the White Lion Public House was only 3 or 4 years old. So again, this is not a picture of old Streatham. This is Mr. Wickham taking a picture of New Streatham. And you can see people outside the pub. You can see the dust suppressor, that cart on the right. That would have been a tank of water, and it would have gone down the high road, spraying the surface with water so the dust didn't rise up in the summer months. There we can see a view down to the shops, to the library, and here we can see some ladies before their sleeves got puffed up, walking down the high road, one pushing a rather elaborate pram. And again, a picture of the library. So after 1898, and we can see in this picture, look, a man and children outside the library in their Sunday best, and a gentleman reading the free newspaper that's been pegged up outside. Such is the quality of the photograph. Then you get your normal views. Here we have Streatham Common Pond with the unusual trees that were such a feature of that site. Looking through those trees, we can see the Greyhound pub on the right, and we get a glimpse of Bank Parade. Bank Parade was erected around 1898. So again, this building could have only have been 2, 3, 5 years old when this picture was taken. Early photography in Streatham. And there's the upper pond, looking up towards the wooded part of the common. And then there is a picture of the Church of the English Martyrs. And again, he's just put a tint on this, a blue wash at the top and a mauve wash, a simple sort of wash, to try and make it a coloured card at a time when you weren't producing true coloured postcards. Here's a picture of the Congregational Church. 1901 it was built, and that's probably shortly after they took the scaffolding down, he went along and took that picture. So now I'm going to show you a few views of some very early Streatham photographers. We don't know who they are. Their name isn't on the card. We don't know where the pictures were sold, but we know they're very early. We either know they're early because they've got Queen Victoria's stamp on the back or an early date on the back. And let's have a look at them. Very early view there of St Leonard's Church, very similar to the view that Walter Brown was taking that we saw earlier. I think this card was probably taken by the man that did the library card and the English Martyrs card that we saw at the beginning of my talk, those cards on the blue card with a space on the right. Again, the pond at the top of the common. And then an interesting series of cards. That's how the card looks when you buy it and you send it out. It's either got a wide margin down the right-hand side or it's got a wide margin at the bottom. And the reason for this is the man is using a camera with a different size plate. So he can't produce images 6x4 because the plate he's using is less than that size. So he has to make the difference up by having these blanks on the card. So I'm going to ignore the blanks and show you his pictures. And there's the picture, you can see it more clearly now, of Tootingbeck Common in the snow. All I would say was there was a heavy fall of Streatham in 1898, so it could have been taken then. Here's a picture looking up Streatham High Road with the green on the left-hand side. You can see the large elm trees. Look how muddy and pitted the high road is. There's a view of the library, erected in 1898. There's no tram lines here, so that would be before 1908. So it's a 10-year period when that card was taken. Now, I was going to ask you, does anybody recognise that road? Yes, you say, it's Sunny Hill Road. Quite right. How observant of you. But can you see how cobbled the streets are? They were made up of cobbled tar blocks mainly. And when they came to asphalt over the road, those tar blocks were sold off and people burnt them at home like you would burn coal for heating. But you look at that and you can hardly recognise Sunny Hill Road. You're looking at a rural lane, aren't you? A country lane in Streatham. And there's a picture of the pond at the top of the common looking north down upon it. And on the right, peering between the trees, you can see Hill House, a large mansion that stood opposite the pond. And then, of course, you have your churches, Emmanuel Church, and there's an interior view of the English martyrs. That would have been a difficult shot to make because he would have had to have done that on a time exposure, and to get the rays of sunlight coming through like he has shows a particular expertise there with the photographer. That's why you do not get many, inverted commas, cheap photographs of the insides of buildings. Very difficult to photograph just using a still camera. And then another view of St Leonard's Church. Hasn't changed much over the years, except we no longer have the flagpole on the roof. Well, I could go on like this for Streatham for miles and miles, but somebody's going to tell me what the time is now. 8:15. So I've done an hour, and I think we'll stop there, I think, because if I get another one, I shall be another hour and a half. But if anybody's got a question, I'll be pleased to answer it. But before that, I just want to thank these people who have very kindly lent me some of their postcards, which I've included in our presentation. And firstly, Arian and Graham Gower, friends in the Streatham Society, they started the first collection of postcards of Streatham. And they provided, through their collection over 20 or 30 years, the backbone of views that we enjoy today. And my thanks also to my friend Kevin Kelly, who's been collecting cards almost as long as I have, for lending me views. I don't know who that man is, but he may be with us this evening. Thank you, Tony, for the cards that you've given me over the years, which we featured this evening. My friend Brian Bloyce, sadly not with us now, used to be secretary of the Streatham Society. He was an avid postcard collector, as was Keith Holdaway, who only died earlier this year. And you can see him there with one of his displays of postcards he put on in Norwood. And then finally, two further friends, Colin Crocker and Andrew Haddon. And it's a joy of collecting postcards that we share them amongst ourselves. And the idea is to get the views out there as much as we can. And it's not time for tea, but I have produced some books on Streatham postcards called Bygone Streatham in Old Postcards, Bygone Streatham Streets, that's the side streets in old picture postcards, and my latest book, Bygone Streatham High Road and Streatham Hill in old picture postcards. I know what you're saying. I can't afford £25 for a book like that. Well, believe it or not, I'm going to charge you 25. I'm not even going to charge you 20 or 10. They are available tonight for only £6. I know, I'm robbing myself. But if any of you would like one, there's £6 each, or all three for £15. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you enjoyed the views that we've seen. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes.
On the early postcard, it didn't have the addresses between
No, I'm not quite sure when Southwest 16 and 12 came in, but it was in the very early 1900s. For many years, you just saw London SW, which meant Southwest London. And there was no need. I have postcards at home, i.e. postcards that have been sent in the late 1890s, early 1900s, without a word of a lie that just says Mr. John Brown Streatham. You know, it was a country village and it would find you. It was only when the town became much more suburbanized, as we got closer and closer to the First World War, that you started finding that people had to put the full address. And then as the post office has started grappling with millions and millions of items of post, not just postcards, but letters, they had to find a better way of sorting them. And that's when they introduced the postcodes. And that's why today, Southwest 16 covers such a large area. You can be living in Norbury or Thornton Heath and you've got a Southwest 16 postcode. But of course, when it was introduced, it was principally just the village of Streatham. All those were fields. And then it was in the 1980s, wasn't it, or the 70s, the post office refined the postcode with an additional 3 letters, copying a system that had been introduced in Canada. And that was to enable automatic sorting. So a man sits at the machine, the item of mail comes in front of him, and he just types the postcode, and it's automatically tracked to the man who's going to do that post run, you know, deliver the mail the next day. And that cut down a lot of time in the delivery of post. So yes, as I say, early cards, Streatham was so small that a name and the town will get you there. It wouldn't today. Yes, and of course, some of the streets changed their names, which made it more difficult. We saw a view, didn't we, of Liam Lane. Well, Liam Lane became Sunny Hill Road. How confusing is that for the postman? Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I heard that the post office introduced the numbering system, the house number system in the 1890s, and that before that houses would just have a name.
That's not quite true. What happened was that the responsibility for street naming was a responsibility of the London County Council. And they set down rules well before the 1890s, in the 1860s. What were their rules? Well, let me tell you what they were. Odd numbers on one side of the road, even numbers on the other side of the road. Your numbers start at the major road. So if you're number 1 Downbrook Road, your end of the road is going to be near a high street. No sub numbers, so you don't get 1, 1A, 1B, 1C, you get 1, 2, 3. In street naming, there will be no streets with the same name in the same locality. That was a problem because every town had a high street, every town had a King Street or a new road. And so over a period of 40 or 50 years, the LCC, the London County Council, abolished hundreds, if not thousands of those names. Hence, High Street Streatham became Streatham High Road. You see how subtly that name has changed. And even today, those rules apply. You cannot have a street name in Streatham which can be confused with a similar name, say in Tooting or Clapham or Croydon. And the reason why that is now more important than it was before is if there is a fire, somebody who may not be native to England, may not speak English very well, reporting the fire may get the name of the street confused. And therefore the 999 operator has to clearly know where the fire is. So if we have a King Street in Streatham and we have a King Street in Croydon, the person who say, look, there's a fire in King Street may not realise that they're in Croydon or Streatham, may not know. I know it sounds silly, but it does happen. That's why they have those rules. And some streets in Streatham, to avoid this problem of having sub-name numbers, you know, 27A, B and C, the streets were renumbered. And the GLC, the LCC, have renumbered some streets in Streatham 5 or 6 times, Liam Court Road 5 or 6 times. This was never popular because you were living in a house and you had your printed stationery that said you were living at 69 Liam Court Road. And now the LCT says, no, you're not, you're living at 136 Liam Court Road, you know, and this means that some people would come down to Liam Court Road to see you and they'd be knocking on number 26 and the people there don't know you because you're at number 136 now. You can see the confusion. So the cost and the inconvenience of street renumbering. But they give the LCC their due. They persevered with this. And they were still renumbering streets up to the time of the Second World War. But by the time you got to the Second World War, many streets had been done and had been renumbered. But there are still anomalies. For example, in Colmer Road in Streatham, there is no number 11 because the house at that spot was bombed in the Second World War. And instead of building 3 houses, they only built 2. So one number had to go. Why they didn't get rid of number 13, I don't know, but they got they got rid of number 11. And that you get where rebuilding after the war, you've got no number 26 because they haven't built the houses in the same quantity as they were there previously. So yes, and the naming of houses, that again was a contentious issue because people would live at the Elms or the Oaks, and they would say, well, I don't want to live at 27. I want to live at the Oaks, you know, and people would still write to them at the Oaks and they wouldn't put 20. Can you imagine when a postman no longer knows his area, you know, no longer know the difficulty he would have deciding? Well, many houses, if you live in an Edwardian house, perhaps you've got the name of your house still in stained glass above the door. That was quite common. But then people would come into the house and they think, well, I don't want to live in the Oaks. You know, I want to live in Mallory Towers. And so they'd take that window out, you know. So there were all these complications, but you're quite right. The post office benefited, but it was mainly done for the emergency services. And so that you would know when you're in a road, even numbers on one side, odd numbers on the other, the lower the number, the nearer you are to a high road or a major road or a B road. The higher the number, the farther away you are from it.
John, any more questions, Dave? Would you mind repeating the question?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, right. I'm so sorry. What was your question?
Well, I think I started by saying, did the post office introduce the numbering system
Yes.
in the 1890s?
Excellent. Yes, the young lady asked if the post office introduced a numbering system in the 1890s. I think probably they may have started to introduce the coding, Southwest London, WC London, West Central London, and Southeast London at that time. Anybody else? Good.
A couple of questions online.
Oh, okay.
One of the questions was when you were discussing about the postcards that were coloured. The question
Yes.
is, was the colouring done on the postcards in Germany done by hand, or was it using stencils?
No, I think it was a printed process. Germany was way ahead of Britain in colour printing. And in fact, Britain didn't really overtake that until after the First World War. Yes, and if you buy a good quality colour card, postcard of anywhere, it might not just be Streatham, if you turn it over, odds on you will find that it's been produced by a German company like Stengel or someone like that, who were very prominent in that field.
And another couple of questions. Was postcard collecting as popular or more popular than stamp collecting?
I think it was as popular. A number of postcards, when you turn them over, people have steamed off the postage stamps. So obviously they collected stamps rather than postcards. But it's just the sheer quantity. I don't know how many postcards have I got of Streatham, in the thousands. Here I am, 120 years after postcards were circulated, and I have built up a collection of several thousand postcards of Streatham. That just gives you an idea of how many were produced and sent and how many people collected them and kept them. Today, perhaps postcard collecting isn't as popular as stamp collecting because we don't produce postcards anymore. What was the death of the postcard? Well, what was the birth of the postcard was instant messaging, wasn't it? You know, letting people know so that Tim can come to dinner. What killed instant messaging? The telephone. Telephone started to be introduced in the 1920s and 30s, but as you got nearer and nearer to the war, in inverted commas, ordinary people on a modest wage, could afford to have a telephone. And therefore, if they wanted Tim to come to dinner, we ring him up straight away, and he says, yes, please, straight away. I don't have to fiddle and fap around with a postcard. I don't have to pay a halfpenny stamp. I don't have to do any of that. He tells me on the telephone. So what's been the death of the telephone? It's been the phones you've got in your pocket, hasn't it? Email and things like that. So all these things have their time, and then they're superseded by modern technology.
We've got a few more questions.
Oh, right, okay.
Do complete sets of all these cards exist in personal collections, or in archives, or are there still gaps that remain to be filled?
There are still gaps that I have to be filled. Marion and Graham Gower's collection had a number of gaps that we have filled since then. There are postcard collections in local archives, and we're very fortunate in that there was a very prolific photographic postcard producer called Johns, who was based in Longley Road in Tooting, who took a lot of pictures of Clapham, Streatham, Tooting, Wandsworth, and his glass plates survive. Many of his glass plates survive, and some of them are in Wandsworth archives, some of them are in Lambeth archives, and as a consequence, we have those images that we can draw on today. Yes, but as I've shown you here with those CP and Co cards, I know there's 150, and I've got 30, so I'm still looking. Yes.
And I think the last question from online was, what size were the glass plates in the postcards that made the amount of detail as you zoomed in, as it was amazing?
Yes, I think the glass plates, I think, were double size to the postcards, which were 6x4. But it's because it's not only the size of the glass plate that's important, it's the fact that you're capturing the image on such a clear, pristine form like glass. If you look at a picture that you take that's printed under not a microphone, a magnifying glass, you will see the wrinkles in the paper, and all that distorts the image. Well, the glass is clear and smooth. And of course, one person is about to send you a message there. How can I get the books when I'm not here? You go to the Streatham Society website, just Google Streatham Society and go to the book page.
Awesome.
Oh, another question.
No, I think
That's it, is it?
I think that's pretty much all the questions. So, yes.
Good. Right. Well, thank you very much indeed. So how do you switch me off?